recording. There isn't a chat, there's a moderated Q&A, but published in that already should be a copy of the report. So please download that and we'll keep posting it so that you can see it. The report isn't going to be the last word on this subject, by the way. This team is going to be working with practitioners to put these best practices in motion. There are going to be training materials coming and continued engagement with the reintegration mission community at the federal, state, local, and tribal levels. Okay. Here's how the next hour will fly. We start with a lightning round. Each panelist will take about 5 to 7 minutes to focus remarks around a specific question that I will ask. This is very hard work for them. Have lots of empathy because truly they could spend an hour talking about this question. So just know they're trying to give the high points. That's every panel's disclaimer. We take an issue. It deserves a lot more time than it gets, and we just scratched the surface. But we hope you keep coming back for more information. Following that, we'll have time for a few questions from you. So please send them in to the Q&A. And then the panelists will go back for a very short, and we're talking short, 1 to 2 minute recap, and I'll close it out. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Department of Homeland Security and the Science and Technology Directorate within the department, which funded this project and is funding our research. NCITE, if you're not familiar with us, is based at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. We are the Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence for Terrorism and Targeted Violence Research. Our consortium spans 26 higher ed institutions in 3 countries. And we are proud to be located in the state of Nebraska, which, separate from the department's funding, is paying for a bench of researchers here, including Austin. So we're going to get to Austin. He is a political scientist at UNO. He directs counterterrorism research initiatives at NCITE. He's the PI on this project. He went to Iraq and the Netherlands last year as part of his research, and he is leading the team assembled to answer the pressing question, what do we do about foreign terrorist fighter families languishing in detention camps overseas where the conditions are just horrible? Home countries are being pressured to take back the people there. The U.S. is going to resettle U.S. persons who left the United States willingly or not to support the Islamic State. Repatriation is a complicated process, and this report will explain why, but there is a pathway to resettlement. So Austin, let's get right to you. Tell us what reintegration is. Tell us what the goals and objectives of these programs are. And what does that look like for this audience of foreign terrorist fighter families?
Sure. Thanks so much for the introduction and for the questions, Aaron. First, let me just take a moment to say thanks to everyone who's online with us today for spending part of your day with us at this NCITE event. In my brief time today, and Aaron, I promise to keep it brief, I'm going to just outline some of the goals and objectives that we have found may facilitate the sustainable, durable, and holistic reintegration of foreign fighter families, and then just discuss briefly a bit about what that may look like under the hood. At that point, I'll be really happy to hand over the mic and enjoy a moment to sit back and learn from my brilliant fellow panelists before we jump into a group discussion and Q&A. First, let's level set on the current set of challenges that are really motivating this work. As Aaron Grace mentioned, according to the U.S. State Department, currently detained in northeastern Syria are approximately 2,000 former male combatants associated with the Islamic State from 60 different countries outside of Syria and Iraq. In addition to those are 10,000 displaced persons also from outside the region, namely to include suspected spouses and children of those foreign terrorist fighters. Some of these persons have been detained for up to half a decade or even born there in facilities where living conditions are often quite horrific. In addition, some of the residents have maintained an adamant adherence to the Islamic State's ideology and perpetrated severe ideologically motivated violence against other facility residents. And so in addition to what I think are clear humanitarian concerns, the risk of an ISIS resurgence centered around and extending from these detention facilities also remains very real. And so in response to this complicated threat picture, U.S. leadership has made repatriation of these persons a priority, where bipartisan consensus has been that the repatriation of foreign terrorist fighter families from northeastern Syria should be done expediently and effectively. The U.S. has encouraged other nations to follow suit, and we have seen some progress in this regard. I actually just saw a recent estimate that more than 500 women and minors were repatriated from the Al-Hol and Raj camps in Syria by 12 different countries in 2022. This would represent a marked and considerable increase relative to prior years. But if you compare those numbers, still comparing those numbers really to the number of persons still in detention, it's clear that there's still much work that remains to be done. From a U.S. perspective, the number of U.S. persons that have already been repatriated represents a relatively small percentage of the total number of foreign persons still held in detention in northeastern Syria. 39 people have been brought back formally by the United States. That includes 15 adults, 24 minors, but it's not generally known how many U.S. persons remain still in detention abroad. And so the question that remains here out of this puzzle, and it's really the question at the center of the project that we're discussing today, is how do we get this right? How do we avoid the common pitfalls of more makeshift or reactive ad hoc policy and ensure that the reintegration process in the United States and elsewhere is informed by evidence best practices? Given the relatively small number of persons to be repatriated or returned to the US, and I think also being aware of the current political will and resources that may be available, there's a real opportunity to do this well. And we, as a research team and as an extension of this project, want to help support that effort. And so to help answer that question, our team's drawing on insights from our independent research over the past decade and collectively as a team over the past last year and a half to 2 years. As Aaron Grace mentioned, that's included fieldwork on the ground in Europe, the Middle East, the US. We've produced publications in academic journals, and we've participated in more practitioner or applied workshops. What we've found across that research design and our research efforts are evidence-based best practices that can be conjoined into a coherent and streamlined approach. And that's really why we're here today is to discuss and promote those best practices. So what does that look like? From the start, no reintegration programming is going to be effective without a clear understanding of what success means and how it can be measured. It is essential to first define those goals and objectives to guide the process of reintegration. And so as a set of collected processes, reintegration ultimately aims, its ultimate goal is to foster a sense of inclusiveness and belonging in the community and to reduce the risk of engagement, re-engagement, or recidivism into violent extremism. And I think it's worth and important to note here is it's not just about the returnees themselves. Repatriation is fundamentally about the nature of that direct relationship between returnees and their new home and host communities. In addition, I think as an important first step or just at a top level, it's also important to recognize that reintegration isn't just one single process, but it relies on the compilation and integration of several overlapping processes. As a result, there's really no shortage of challenges to getting this right. In support of that goal, though, I'm a big believer in aim small, miss small. If we see community inclusiveness and minimize risk as desirable end goals, a couple of pointed high resolution objectives can help to guide and facilitate those outcomes. I'll just mention them briefly here, being aware that we're probably short on time, is that first, it's important that policy built around reintegration be aligned with the scope and nature of a country's specific returnee profile. It's different if a country is expecting to receive 50 returnees or 700. This element would also include close and careful attention to gender and age-related considerations. Second is that returnee plans should be tailored to each case when possible, but ultimately guided by common strategic principles, things like sensitivity to stigmatization, a focus on the family as a collective unit, and ensuring access to trauma-informed care. Third, and this is, I mean, prosecution has been the norm for adult returnees to the US, but I think it's still important to emphasize that the reintegration efforts should be integrated into existing legal basis and on a rule of law basis. And finally, fourth, reintegration doesn't happen in a vacuum. What happens in the reintegration space is going to carry ripple effects, cascading effects, and so it should be coordinated with and in sort of perspective of other related policy efforts and priorities, things like homeland security, civil rights and liberties, resilience, and community welfare. There's obviously a lot more to unpack here, a lot more to say on this. At this point, though, I want to turn it back over to my colleagues to learn from them, and I'll look forward to more to our group discussion and Q&A. Thanks, Erin. Back over to you.
Thank you, Austin, and pretty good job on time there. Next up, we have Andrew Mines. He is a research fellow at the Program on Extremism, an investigator with NCITE, and his core research focuses on the global Islamic State movement, particularly its networks throughout Iraq, Syria, and the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. You know, Andrew, we want to talk to you about trauma-informed care, which is often cited by practitioners and other experts as not just a nice to have, but a need to have. So tell us what that is, what you've learned about why it's important for reintegrating the families. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron, and thank you, Austin. And just to echo what's been said, just a quick thank you to NCITE and DHS S&T for both spearheading and supporting this research project, and really creating a space for us to pull together what we hope will be useful findings to support this complicated but really necessary mission. And I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to join this team and be part of this broader effort. So, the first part of your question, Aaron, what is trauma-informed care? When we talk about trauma-informed care, we're really talking about an approach that acknowledges the pervasive nature of trauma and then advocates for understanding, respecting, and then appropriately responding to the effects of trauma. And this can happen at all levels and in multiple settings. So at the highest level, we're talking about how we shape a general approach. It's important to note here that trauma-informed care is not the same thing as trauma assessment and trauma treatment. That involves the formal diagnosis by a licensed professional of medically defined trauma-related disorders like PTSD, and then, if applicable, the creation of a treatment plan that can involve medication, therapy, and therapeutic techniques, or some combination of the two. So trauma assessment and trauma treatment can be part of the broader universe of a trauma-informed care approach, but they're certainly not the only two options, and they're certainly not the same thing. And that's important to highlight in this context, or really any context for that matter. But to the second part of your question, why is trauma-informed care not just nice to have, but need to have for reintegrating families? And to put a fine point on it, returnees and their families have been exposed to a complex range of traumatizing experiences while overseas, certainly, but potentially as part of the repatriation and reintegration processes themselves. So if those traumas go unaddressed, individuals and possibly whole families are likely to encounter substantial roadblocks in their reintegration journeys over the short and long term. In fact, trauma does have the potential to be one of the primary barriers to successful reintegration of individuals and families. So if our goal, as Austin mentioned, is their successful reintegration, then trauma-informed care needs to be an essential principle of our response. So what does that look like? What are the key challenges that are wrapped into this problem set from a trauma-informed perspective, and what are some best practices that we can offer to help incorporate and address those challenges? So our team identified 4 distinct challenges in the report that, while they're not entirely exhaustive, they do provide what we believe are the major contours of what individuals and families are facing. And first is the fact that, as I mentioned, families reintegrating have been exposed to a complex range of potentially traumatizing experiences. These are likely to go well beyond adverse childhood experiences and can include, in this context that we're speaking about, rape and sexual slavery, war traumas like exposure to conflict, death, child soldiering, coerced and volunteered participation in violence, trauma from forced separation, and as Austin mentioned, extended detention in overseas camps, among others. So second is how trauma is processed and then expressed and ultimately treated, if that is a course of action. That varies dramatically from person to person. The effects of traumatic experiences, in short, they're not uniform. The same experience or set of experiences can culminate in the onset of trauma-related symptoms and potentially even disorders in one person, but they could have lesser effects on other people. The onset of symptoms and disorders can occur well after the initial, or at the very least, the last known incident. And then the experience of trauma and the expression of related symptoms is heavily conditioned by age, gender, cultural, and other factors. When we talk about treatment, if treatment options are pursued, the efficacy of different types of treatment, if they are undertaken, that varies substantially too, and that's important to keep in mind. The third challenge is that trauma-related symptoms and then stigma associated with mental health concerns, and then seeking or accepted help, whether those are from external sources in people's social environments or it's internalized self-stigma. All of those can impede help-seeking behavior, the identification of trauma, and then openness to care providers in different settings. And this is very serious implications for formal assessment and then treatment if that's an option that's being explored. And then the final thing is that not all systems are equally prepared to provide trauma-informed care. In fact, involvement with some types of systems like prison facilities may be unavoidable in some cases, but there are important factors to consider in terms of their ability to re-traumatize, to newly traumatize, and certainly to impede the ability of family members to try to form healing relationships as well as other dynamics. And this is not to advocate for an approach that throws justice and accountability, which are essential components of this entire process. This is not to throw those to the wind. It's merely to say that from a trauma-informed perspective, these kinds of dynamics have to be taken into account and factored into planning decisions. And then the last thing to note here is that providers and services in many communities across this country are still experiencing shortages, burnout, understaffing as a result of the global pandemic, and that's led to no small amount of fatigue and resource shortages. So plenty of challenges, but our team has identified some best practices that we believe can help address these issues. I'll go over them quickly, but the report really does spell these out in further detail, and we hope it can be a good resource for folks on this call and others. And the first is to equip case managers and providers with ongoing expert consultation and then resources. The Islamic State as a global phenomenon requires its own input, its own insights from subject matter experts, but those should augment existing capacities and resources and not replace them wholesale. The second is to ensure that the process for identifying and treating trauma-related symptoms and disorders is sustainable. That was the word that Austin mentioned. Sustainability is key, and then tailored to individual needs. This really means not just intelligently sequencing trauma assessment and treatment, again, if those are undertaken, intelligently sequencing those with other services, but also taking into account age, gender, and cultural considerations, as I mentioned, and really committing to the long haul to ensure that those needs are met. The third is to incorporate assessment tools, education, credible messengers to help overcome trauma-related symptoms and stigmas. And there are a plethora of existing resources, tools, NGOs, community-based organizations that do have great experience dealing with trauma and reintegration, and their expertise can and should be sought out when appropriate. The fourth is to match people reintegrating to appropriate settings. You know, when we talk about where resources are scarce versus where they're strong, there's no one-size-fits-all solution here, but rather an imperative to carefully consider the dynamics and then the possible impacts of, as I mentioned, justice system involvement on this process. And then it's also important to consider which case managers can adequately attend to the needs of folks we're talking about here, and to consider where it is that mental health and psychosocial support services are strongest and have the best comparable resources and experience. And then finally, I know I'm running a bit long here, I do apologize, but the final note is to really integrate evaluation early and throughout the reintegration process, and to recognize that success, from a trauma-informed approach, in terms of managing trauma, success will look different for different people. That's unavoidable and that's okay. So I'm happy to speak to any of these details in more detail later on, but the report unpacks these challenges and best practices a bit more. We do hope you'll check it out. So thank you again, Erin. I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And thank you for explaining that. Everything you said makes sense, doesn't it? So Julie Coleman's going to get into this in a little more detail. She is a judicial affairs officer with the United Nations mission in Kosovo. Prior to that gig, she was a senior research fellow and lead of the program on preventing and countering of violent extremism. I had to read that at the International Center for Counterterrorism, where her work focused on the prevention of radicalization and violent extremism, particularly on the management of radicalization in prisons, and on the rehab and reintegration of violent extremist offenders and returning foreign terrorist fighters and their families. She has supported prison administrations and other institutional actors in developing countries in conducting risk assessments, including the support and development of risk assessment tools. So Julie, you're really going to be perfect to speak about this next question. You know, these reintegration and reentry programs, as you know, focus heavily on male combatants in general. but could you please speak to the unique challenges and solutions that come into play when we think about what is involved in reintegrating families, namely women and children? And what did that look like in Kosovo? Maybe you could apply that too.
Sure, certainly. And just as a quick, before I start, to say thank you for the invitation to take part in this panel today. And I should caveat that my remarks today will be of my own opinion and not representative of the viewpoints of the UN. But yeah, to launch already into your question, I mean, I think even the framing of the question suggests one of the most significant challenges, that we're historically dealing with men, right? Male combatants, male VEOs. You know, my work in prisons, you know, really primarily centers around adult men. And even for that population, when we think about what we know in terms of risk assessment or what makes for effective rehabilitation interventions, how do you support these individuals after their release when they reintegrate back into society? Even there, what we do know, is about men, but there are many, many gaps that remain. And that is just compounded quite significantly when it comes to women and children, because it's quite a relatively new phenomenon that women and children comprise the vast majority of who we're talking about when we have these CT or CVE related conversations. So that's the first real challenge. And I always think that women and women affiliated with violent extremism are, I would say, arguably much more complex or much more difficult cases in many ways than men. And that's for a number of reasons. I think it's partly because of the diverse motivations for women to have engaged in violent extremism. You know, when we think about the women who have traveled to Syria and Iraq, we have a huge range of experiences. We have women who were trafficked. We have women who were coerced or maybe tricked or forced to go by their husbands, by their fathers. But then you also have women who acted with agency, who saw something very appealing about the narrative that was being espoused by the Islamic State, and they actively chose to go. And in some cases, what we see is they are the ones who sort of pushed their husbands and families into going, or otherwise, of course, we know many, many young women traveled on their own. But so that gives a lot of complexity to that group, in addition to the fact that once they were there, they had very different roles. So you have women who would be part of the morality police, really enforcing these draconian laws and regulations. You had other women who were much more confined to the home, but still maybe had a really significant influence on their children and the indoctrination of their children. And then you have women who maybe did act with agency and chose to go, but we're still subject to forced marriage, forced pregnancies, sexual abuse, rape, all of these things. So that makes them a really challenging group to understand sort of the underlying causes of their participation, if they did actively participate, but particularly to shape what we're going to do to support them and to make sure that they don't pose a risk to society upon their reintegration. And then children, again, really complex. We talk about children, so we lump everyone, under 18 altogether. But of course, as Andrew already alluded to, the age and gender of the children makes a really significant difference. So I think these complexities of these two groups are really something that need to be taken into account to better understand their needs and better understand what maybe is going to work most effectively. Much more concretely, some of the challenges that we see, I'm thinking of children who have come back, for example, the Western Balkans region is one of the few regions in the world that have very actively repatriated their nationals. So countries like Kosovo, but also Bosnia, Albania, North Macedonia. But often the children come back and there's a huge language barrier. Children that were born under the Islamic State territory don't speak the mother tongue of these countries. So that just makes it very practically difficult for experts, whether it's, social workers, psychologists, other different actors who might be trying to interact with them. That really creates a significant barrier. There's also, of course, a lot of mistrust of authority amongst these actors, particularly amongst the children. So getting them to sort of effectively engage, again, with the sort of rehabilitation and reintegration team is another really significant challenge. And I think that there's no country that's gotten it perfectly right, but I think we do see some positive trends. What we see in the Balkan region that I think is something that can be very much seen as a good practice is these are regions that have a history of conflict. There's a history of giving trauma-informed care, and so taking the lessons that we know from those experiences, although they're different from the Islamic State and the experiences that women and children went through there, taking what's already known, taking what expertise already exists and applying that to this cohort rather than looking at it as a problem that needs an entirely new solution. All right, so it's really, capitalizing on the capacities and the skills and expertise that's already there. And then, the family unit also, while a lot of people, I think, have a very stereotyped fear, for example, of women coming back with their children, that can be a great opportunity for these interventions as well. So we know in general, women disengage from all sorts of violence, whether it's organized crime, cults, gangs, but also violent extremism. Usually having children is the biggest factor that motivates a woman to disengage voluntarily. So the fact that these women are coming back with children can be used as an impetus for them to really leave behind, their previous engagement. And that's not to say that their children should be instrumentalized, but it's just worth noting that it's not necessarily a good thing, let's say, to separate every child from their mother that are coming back. Sometimes keeping the family unit together can pose challenges, but also offers a lot of benefits, and can make the women and the children more likely to engage in these reintegration programming and engage with the different actors who are trying to offer them support. But overall, I would just sort of really quickly conclude my brief remarks here by just saying that I think the biggest challenge that we see overall always has to do with the stereotyped ideas that we have of these individuals who are coming back. So, whether it's looking at the women as, the quote unquote jihadi brides, as, the term, I think we've moved a bit away from that as a global public. But I think, looking at these women as a homogenous group, perhaps looking at them as not posing any risk or not having any agency or autonomy, I think that can be a really big pitfall that then maybe makes it less likely that they will get the type of support that they really need to actually disengage and remain disengaged. And then the same with children, this narrative of treating these young people who were affiliated with the Islamic State through no choice of their own, treating them as the, proverbial, future problem or the ticking time bomb. I mean, I think that's such a harmful, narrative and rhetoric. And so I think really cutting through those and looking at everything on an individual tailored basis and really trying to take what we already know and what we've seen work elsewhere with child soldiers, with women who've gone through trauma, and capitalizing on those, I think, is a really effective way forward. So I'll leave it there for now, but yeah, really happy to answer more questions afterwards.
Julie, thank you. And just to put an exclamation point on that, the caution against homogenization, the caution against stereotyping, and really trying to make this reintegration process not a one size fit all, but tailor-made is so important. So thank you for that. Last but certainly not least, because he provides such a unique and important perspective to this, is Omar Mohammed. He is a historian from Mosul, Iraq. And honestly, I hope it's not too shameless to say I consider you a very brave person who was blogging about what was happening as the Islamic State was attacking, and being able to see the rebirth that comes after the horrific experiences. You are now living in exile in Europe. You're the host of a podcast series, Mosul and the Islamic State. I mean, I could go on and on about your fantastic bio here, but you're currently teaching Middle East history, cultural heritage, diplomacy at Sciences Po University. And as a historian and lecturer at the University of Mosul, you would focus your scholarly work on conceptual history and research. You are a regular media commentator on Iraq, and I just want to turn it over to you because, like I said, I would chew up all the time talking about it. So, Omar, please, Iraq is a notable case, being so geographically proximate to the detainment camps and experiencing so much of the ISIS-related violence. Please speak to the role of justice and local perceptions of justice when it comes to reintegration of these ISIS-affiliated families in Iraq.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Austin, for organizing this very important and timely discussion. It's really a pressing issue and it requires a lengthy discussion. And I hope we will be able to at least cover the overall structure of this dilemma, I would say, when it comes to Iraq. It might be quite different when it comes to foreign fighters who have returned to their countries or are waiting to be returning to their country of origin or wherever they will be taken. When it comes to Iraq, we are not speaking only about individuals who have been actually deported from their cities or individuals who are waiting in a whole camp. We are speaking about a process that started immediately after the defeat of Daesh or ISIS, and it became the norm when there was no a strong rule of justice and rule of law. People wanted to take it into their own hands, but it was also connected to politics and connected to also to who is actually liberating those cities, whether it's Mosul or Anbar. And because of the complicated relation between, I will speak in very frank concepts here, how Daesh wanted to make the Sunnis complicit with its own ideology, and that Daesh presented itself as a Sunni group. Therefore, the Sunnis were seen as collaborators with Daesh. When the troops came to liberate Mosul, the majority of the security forces were either Shia or mixed groups. Many of the tribes wanted to clear their names, and this is when it all happened. The larger tribes, the stronger tribes, actually took over the weaker tribes and say that we are going to sacrifice those tribes. So we are speaking about entire tribes were completely deported from their areas, whether they had connection with Daesh or not. And we are speaking here about entire families, male, women, children, etc., were completely deported, including others who have already escaped the battle in 2016, 2017, and found themselves in Al-Hol camp before Al-Hol camp becomes a spot where Daesh fighters and family members were detained after the defeat of Daesh in Al-Baghouz. And imagine those families who were escaping Daesh eventually found themselves living with Daesh itself in the Al-Hol camp. And many of them, unfortunately, not willingly, were radicalized. Speaking also of the entire social process and how the anti-Daesh sentiment became also a political tool in those areas. To gain power, you must show that you are entirely against Daesh. But showing this is not enough in itself. You have to sacrifice some people in the process. And it became a chaotic social problem in Mosul. Not to mention that most of this and the main challenge when it comes to the returnees, there are actually three elements. One is the justice system. Is the justice system in Iraq capable or able to actually provide and bring those preparators of Daesh to justice? Is the justice system is able to provide the victims with justice? Is there a judicial system? Is there a process where people, if they were collaborating with Daesh or they are Daesh, is there a system that actually can process them in a very transparent process? The second thing is, are we actually, because that's the case in Iraq, unfortunately, are we prosecuting Daesh politically, or we are looking into every single crime they have committed? What happened in Iraq is that no matter who the person is, no matter what the relation to Daesh was, as long as you are there, as long as you were there, as long as you have been arrested during the battle, then you will be seen just like Daesh. And that is the main problem, that the problem became more social, political, rather than related to justice. The second thing is, in fact, it becomes very difficult and very complicated to speak about returnees or Daesh-related families when we are talking about first a genocide against the Yazidis. The entire deportation of the Christians and the destruction of their holy sites, and the destruction of almost 80% of the urban centers in the area where Daesh controlled for over 3 years. It is a very complicated question when you speak to people, even if you run a survey for research. The first answer you get from the people when you say, are you with those families returning to their places of origin? The answer will be not immediately no, but they will say, but what can you do for me? Can you rebuild my house? Can you rebuild the school? Can you rebuild the city? So it's more connected to the recovery of these cities, which is why there are actually very important and successful examples when it comes to the two sides of the story. First is the destruction, and the second is it possible to reintegrate those families back in either their areas or in a different geographical areas within the region and within Iraq. Yes, in fact, there were successful examples when we worked at the same time simultaneously on the recovery of those sites, on the recovery of those cities, and started educating the communities on and raising more awareness about why it's very important to establish the reconciliation process, why it's more important to think about rehabilitating your area, but at the same time thinking about the future of your geographical areas, whether it's dominated by Christians or Yazidis or Muslims, Sunnis, Shia, etc. It doesn't matter. We are speaking about an entire destruction, loss of social structure, the system of trust among all these populations. So there are examples where organizations started working on first rehabilitation of the victims of Daesh, rehabilitation of the cities, running endless workshops of interaction among the communities. It doesn't matter, or it doesn't have to be between the returnees of Daesh or the people of this area, but rather among the tribes themselves. It is important to think about the future of your city. What do you want? Do you want a forever revenge from those people? How do you want to run your city after 5 years, after 10 years? How are you going to deal with this? And to be honest, this has been working very well, given that the returning number of the ISIS precede families is not being in a very large number, and it makes it much easier when you slowly actually send them back and reintegrate them, but also providing them with the needs of, for example, the first important thing is the documentation, the official documentation. Many of them do not have IDs, and many of those children were born with no official ID. They cannot access health facilities, they cannot access education facilities, they cannot have any rights because they are stateless in the eyes of the government. But when you work on recovering the community, the welcoming community, and at the same time with very small numbers continuously, the important part here is to have a continuous process, not starting this month and stopping the month after. Or you say, I have this project of reconstruction or rehabilitation running for 2 years, and after that it's done. There is no continuation, there is no sustainability. And the most pressing actually part here is there is a need not only for the reintegration of the foreign fighters or their families, but also the locals. There is a need, a pressing need, to speak about justice in the same way Daesh committed its crimes. Daesh committed its crimes on a global level. Therefore, the response of justice has to be also global on a global platform. This is the only thing that you can show the victims of Daesh. And I will have to be clear here because it's also very important. Recently, when we have seen trials of foreign fighters who committed heinous crimes against journalists who are also foreigners. And this is what the victims were telling me when I was speaking to locals. They say, look how smooth justice system is when the two sides are actually not from here, not from Iraq. You see, that is also very important that we need to also develop our communication, develop our system of dealing with the justice when it comes to wanting to really end the problem of the reintegration. Thank you.
Omar, thank you so much. And I want to hear more about this. You and Julie kind of get at a very important issue. Obviously, you have experienced firsthand. Julie has also seen it in Kosovo, the difficult, complicated reintegration of people right where they're from, or right in that front yard there. And it raises an important question that I'm going to ask right off the bat before we kick it to everyone for Q&A about strategic communications. So you have this very complicated problem with a complex population. How do you communicate to the community receiving them, who they are, and how you are going to balance the needs for justice and security while also humanitarian needs for people to reintegrate successfully? So Andrew, I'd like you to kind of take that. Tell us about the role and value of strategic communications, and Omar, follow it up with what that's kind of looked like in Iraq, if you could.
Well, I can certainly get started with what our team was focused on, which was in the United States perspective. And then when we talk about strategic communications in the US perspective, the primary role of communications should be the management of returnees and their families, and it must directly support policy objectives. That seems like a very simple statement at face value, but actually it's quite vital to say that, because when you connect that to the objectives that Austin was speaking about earlier and that others spoke about, you need to carefully weigh those objectives against what is possible, and make sure that related communications activities are laser focused on supporting those objectives and not others, and don't suffer from creep over the long term or other objectives that don't relate to those policy objectives. So our report actually unpacks these in greater detail, but I'll point to 4 quickly that I think the team identified. The first being the establishment of an overarching method, and that includes considerations for campaign, for message, for rollout, and something we've all talked about extensively throughout the panel, evaluations that feature from the get-go in communications activities. The second is to manage expectations. There are some things that policy objectives cannot achieve, and if strategic communications activities are not aligned with what those policy objectives are saying and what they are doing, then you create a gap that is exploitable, whether it's from foreign influence actors or others in this ecosystem. And so making sure that that gap is narrow and unexploitable is important. The third is to develop a media strategy, to identify what nodes, what individuals, what narratives, what channels are the most impactful. And then to be proactive in your messaging and your outreach planning. A lot of times we get caught in crisis management mode or reactive mode, and there are important activities that can go on the front end to make sure that we're being proactive, that we're priming audiences, identifying who those audiences really are, who our target audiences really are, and making sure that we're reaching them effectively and working with the media ecosystem. And then the fourth is just I'll just touch on it quickly, is to recognize that language matters, and even how we label individuals as foreign terrorist fighters, FTFs, foreign terrorist fighters, that has important impacts on related programming and in the messaging environment, how we receive and how publics receive and think about and react to this problem. So maybe FTF is a term that we stick with, maybe it's not. Maybe there are future terms that we can adopt and that are a bit more flexible, that speak to a range of related issues that we can look at, whether it's foreign conflict returnees or others that we might consider. And so the report unpacks this in a bit more detail. But I'll turn it over to Omar and Julie. I look forward to their thoughts as well.
Yeah, Omar, anything to add, especially as it pertains to how to communicate to communities in which returnees are coming?
Yeah, I think what we need to focus more on is preparing the communities and showing them. I think this is the only thing that we can do, and we will probably will not have to make more efforts on the returnees themselves. We need to show the communities, the victims, and the communities who endured and suffered from Daesh, that justice work. I think that's the challenge that everyone should work on, providing, showing the communities that justice work, that you shouldn't take those matters into your own hands. It is something that, beside that, is also focusing more on the recovery of these areas, showing that you can rehabilitate quickly to prepare them to accept those who are returning. And sometimes we need also to seek other solutions, alternative solutions, not necessarily returning those families to their place of origin, probably in different areas where they might see a new life. Because it's also very important to refer to the social norms in countries like Iraq when it comes especially to women. If those women have returned to their place of origin, whether they were complicit with Daesh or not, those women have already lost their lives. They have no future. They will always, forever be labeled with heinous type of labels. I mean, because of the social norms, because of the tribal norms, etc., etc. So I think we also need to seek alternative solutions, especially when it comes to the reintegration and bringing back those families to the host communities.
Omar, thank you very much. I had another question to come in that I want to kick to Julie. Then Austin, if there's time, this goes along the communication lines. Taking into account the general attitude of nations and governments to do reintegration, how do you balance threat assessment? How do you balance security protections with what folks need for basic human welfare?
Sure. It's a great question and a super complex one. So I'll try to just briefly throw out some thoughts on that. I mean, within the field of sort of, counterterrorism, we use risk assessment, right, as the most common phrase. And I think it's a really big misnomer because I think a lot of people then look at, okay, we're assessing these individuals for risk, and they sort of perceive it as that means these people are inherently dangerous. They're going to pose a risk maybe to society or to the radicalization of others. And to me, what I see as a much more effective tool or approach is looking at risk assessment as a much more holistic process where, yes, you maybe look at, does this person pose a risk of danger or harm to themselves, to the people around them, to the broader community? But the risk assessment process should also give you a lot more detailed information that you can use to build effective approaches to engaging with these individuals, to sort of addressing the underlying causes, the particular needs that they might have, identifying what sort of psychosocial support they would be most responsive to. Do they have education needs? Do they have needs when they return to their communities? Are they going to be ostracized? Do they have a family home that they can go back to? So I think these assessment processes need to be looked at through that lens rather than just looking at the very limited view of risk or of danger that these individuals might pose. And certainly that's not to undervalue the fact that some of them may pose some sort of risk or danger, but many of them won't, or many of them do not, from what we've already seen from those who are coming back from Iraq and Syria. So I think those two sides really need to be balanced whenever we think about assessing these individuals, and think of it more as an information gathering process to build then the later steps that would follow.
Austin, over to you.
Sure, not much to add to that. Julie put it beautifully, and a lot of knowledge and expertise in that succinct and background in this work very succinctly. One thing I liked from Julie's earlier comments was recognizing that stereotypes act often as the foundation for many of the challenges that can come in the reintegration process, right? Because they can promote either an under or an overestimation of both the risks or threats presented potentially by an individual, but also a misalignment with an understanding of their needs. And so just to reinforce what Julie said, I think risk assessment seen in a more holistic way really can serve as the antidote to some of those challenges and symptoms presented by quick and cheap stereotyping. Instead, drilling down to better understand what that individual needs to succeed, as well as areas where they may present vectors of harm, not just to themselves, but also to their community, right? So making sure that they have the tools that they need to achieve that level of inclusiveness that we talked about, while also achieving that other part of the goal of reintegration, which is minimizing the risks that they pose to themselves and others. This idea, the tension, right, that is sometimes seen in the question of risk and threat assessment, the security lens versus welfare provision, I think can sometimes be a false dichotomy. But actually, when done well, I see them as mutually reinforcing practices. They're ultimately focused towards that same outcome, right? Which is the holistic rehabilitation, integration of the person into their host or new home community, while also making sure and having eyes wide open to the potential threats that a given individual may present to their community. And so that balance is necessary, and risk and threat assessment, not just on an initial entry, but actually throughout the process of their reintegration, can be a useful tool to facilitate that.
Thank you, Austin. We are approaching the end of the hour. We're not done yet. And what I'd like to do is invite our audience to send any questions to ncite@unomaha.edu so we can try to answer them. I would like to remind everyone that they can go to our website, unomaha.edu/ncite, and you're going to get a link to the report. You'll get more information about it, and we'll post a recording of this as soon as this is over, and we can do that. But right now, I want to give our panelists the last word. I'd like you to take a minute or two. I know we didn't cover it all, but what final thoughts would you like to leave with our viewers here today? And Austin, I want you to close us out for us. We're going to go in reverse. So we're going to start with Omar, then Julie, then Andrew, then Austin. I want to thank everybody who did come. Thanks to our audience, and a shout out to Ajmal Aziz from S&T, who is here and who shepherded this project through DHS. So Omar, please give us your last thoughts in 1 to 2 minutes.
Thank you. It's always important to insist on this point. We have to show the people that justice works. This is one, because it's the only way we should respond to Daesh. Not only because we want to prosecute them, but Daesh would always want to reuse those communities, to prey on those returnees, or prey on those families who are living in Al-Hor or in any other areas. Second is, once we have made sure that justice worked, we need to show that we are moving beyond Daesh and its time or its period of terror. We have to show the host communities and also the returnees that there is a way out of all of this, that it is possible to reintegrate. I think it's also, when we speak about justice and reintegration, we also need to show them that once you have been cleared, once you have served your time, once you have showed your willingness to reintegrate for your own sake, for the sake of your children, but it cannot be for free. You have to show that you are capable of returning to a normal life, and we are here to support. I think it's also very important to have the sympathy, to show the willingness to actually really end this problem, because it's a pressing problem for almost everyone. For many countries are involved in all of this, and it is an issue that the more we leave it, the more Daesh will benefit from it. We don't want to wait any longer. Thank you.
Go ahead, Julie.
Thanks. Yeah, big shoes to fill following Omar and his eloquent way of summarizing everything. And so I just really want to echo maybe part of that. I think, you know, I would want to just convey the necessity of repatriation and of reintegration. And we've seen countries do it successfully, right? We've seen countries who maybe don't have perfect systems in place, but they've been able to leverage the tools and resources available to do this in a responsible and safe manner. And I think exactly as Omar said, right, the longer we leave individuals languishing in Al-Hol and Al-Raj and detention facilities throughout Northeast Syria, the more this plays into the hands of the Islamic State. And the more we as a global society or as different states, the more we fail our own citizens. And so I think we need to really continue to lean in and to continue to push for states to continue what has so far been a bit of a piecemeal approach, and to doing it sort of as quickly as possible, to not draw this out even further, given the fact that individuals have now been sort of in limbo for years. So I would just, you know, again, as I said before, just really encourage to use what we already know about disengagement, not only from violent extremism, from other forms of violence. What do we know about bringing people back from, you know, conflict-affected areas in terms of reintegrating them back in? You know, we don't need to exceptionalize everything. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. And so I think that if we take these approaches and tailor them to this group of women and children and men who are, you know, sort of the forgotten entity always, I think it's entirely possible to do this, and I think it's really an imperative for all societies.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I couldn't agree more with Omar and Julie. I'll just end very narrowly with what I spoke on earlier about trauma-informed care and what that means in the U.S. setting, and then I'll just say in brief conclusion that if not appropriately addressed, I said this before in my remarks, but if not appropriately addressed, traumas carried by those returning and their families can be one of the most crucial barriers to their reintegration. However, I'll flip that. When implemented effectively, efforts to provide trauma-informed care can not only avoid re-traumatizing individuals or contributing to new traumas, but they can be transformative. And then on the flip side, they can serve as a key driver of a successful reintegration process or processes. So I really just want to emphasize the potential that's here, the potential and possibility of the task that's before those on the call, I'm sure, and others who will be hopefully reading into the report. We have the challenges in there. We have some best practices associated, and I hope it can serve as a valuable resource to everybody. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go ahead and close this out. Just begin by thanking everyone on this call who's joined us today for your time, for sharing part of your Tuesday morning, afternoon, or evening with us. Thank you again to my friends and colleagues that I'm sharing this panel with. It's just been great to hear from your insights, even building on things that we've wrestled with together as a team in developing this work. I'll conclude by saying being sensitive that we're at the top of the hour, that when it comes to reintegration, there is no single instrument or program that's going to be sufficient. It's not just trauma-informed care. It's not only threat assessment, language and cultural training. The success of reintegration will require that these single programmatic initiatives are done right, not only independently, but in concert with the others, and overseen by a community of practitioners with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. And our work and the impetus and spirit of this project is meant to support that effort. Next steps for us are to translate these identified best practices into training materials, to work with practitioners to put these best practices in motion, and to continue to engage with the reintegration mission community at the federal, state, local, and tribal levels. We're excited about this work, excited to continue this effort, and it's a privilege to be part of this team. Aaron, I will turn it back over to you for concluding remarks. Thank you.
Well, my concluding remarks are that you should all have a great day. Check out our website, download their report, and be sure to register for our next event, which will be April 11th. And Andrew Mines will be here for that, and Austin as well. So again, thank you, panelists. Thank you, guests. Thank you, NCITE staff, for putting on a good event. We hope you stay tuned for other NCITE happenings. Have a great day, everybody.